destroy the intellectual case for socialism, but it also, at the same time, was a major contribution to the understanding of the nature and function of the price system. Why a price system was essential to a civilized society. So it was a leap forward, like all good Austrian theory, both in theory, but at the same time, there were immediate implications for policy. Okay. So this article by Mises, as we'll see, really began what was called the socialist calculation debate. I might draw your attention to there's a remarkable epilogue to this work. It's written by a very prominent contemporary Austrian, and it's entitled "Why a Socialist Economy is Impossible," quote unquote. I actually wrote that. But before I had written that, when I sent it to Murray Rothbard, he had said, "You've actually proved to me that a socialist economy is impossible," and that was exactly what Mises meant. He says, "Even I," Murray Rothbard, in my deepest heart, didn't think that a socialist economy was impossible. I just thought it was extremely inefficient and it would eventually break down. So what I try to do in that epilogue, if you'll see, is to boil down Mises' argument and show that it implies that a socialist economy is not only just grossly inefficient or likely to break down, but it is in a non-trivial sense, in a true sense, it's impossible. Okay. Before Mises wrote, before his argument, there had been, in the early 19th century, a number of writers called utopian socialists. And the utopian socialists all put forth their own individual plans for a prosperous humanity. The three most famous utopian socialists were Charles Fourier, Henri Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. The first two were French, the last was Scottish, who had immigrated to the United States. They all had their own ideas on how their particular plan would transform human society into a prosperous commonwealth in which people would have to do very little work, or if they did work, they would enjoy their work, and so on. Let me just give you Charles Fourier's idea. Charles Fourier believed that society should be segmented into what he called phalanstères, which is based on the Roman phalanx. That is 1,600 people, men, women, and children, living communally. Okay, that was the number. Where did he get the number? Well, out of his own fevered brain. These guys were all crazy. He also told us that once the socialist utopia was established, things would change physically too. He actually said that you would have the oceans would eventually turn into lemonade, and that roasted chickens would fly right into your plate. This is in his writings. I'm not, it's shocking, but and he said that the lions would present themselves to human beings to be ridden through the fields. Okay, so they were basically crazy, and they were an embarrassment to the socialist movement. Now, the classical economists, even with their primitive supply and demand, or it wasn't so primitive, their idea of supply and demand, basic supply and demand mechanism, showed how all of these plans were just ridiculous, and that they would never come to fruition in the real world. Now, what Marx did, Marx established scientific socialism. He was embarrassed by the utopian socialists, even though he was influenced by them. But he's embarrassed by their arguments. He had seen that the classical economists had destroyed the intellectual foundations of their plans for humanity. And what he did was to devise an ingenious rhetorical ploy. What he said was the following. He says, if you're a scientific socialist, what you understand is the following, that socialism will replace capitalism, whatever we think about the future, and it will do so inexorably. It's like a law of nature. Just like capitalism was destined to replace feudalism, and feudalism was destined to replace the slave society of ancient Greece and Rome, so it is that socialism, that capitalism is doomed because of its inner contradictions to result in a socialist future. Anyone who tries to predict the socialist future is unscientific. Right? So that shut everybody up. because nobody wanted to be seen as unscientific. So what it did was it stopped all these utopian socialists from talking about what the future would look like. Okay, this was the law of nature. It was coming, whatever we thought, whatever we wrote about it. So Marx himself, his great works, his three-volume work was called Capital. It was a criticism of capitalism. He never really wrote about the future social society. He wrote a little, there's some insights here and there, some hints about what he thought it would look like. But he knew that once you tried to set it out, then you opened yourself to the critiques of economists. Now, the basic debate before Mises wrote was in simple terms, who's going to take out the garbage under socialism? That was the debate. It was on that level. It was also on the level of justice. Okay, whether or not collectivizing or nationalizing the means of production was just. Okay, whether or not the distribution of income under socialism was more just than it was under capitalism. So there was that part of the debate. The only economics involved was whether or not socialism could solve the incentive problem, could give people the incentive to go to work and to produce goods and services, when in fact everybody would get, according to Marx, would produce according to his ability, and the goods would be distributed according to the needs of everyone, or even if it was an equal distribution. Why should anyone go down in coal mines and risk their health and work in a dank environment? Why would anybody under socialism for the same pay get up early in the morning at 4 o'clock and take out the garbage? Okay. The only answer the socialists had to this was, well, under socialism, human nature would be transformed. A new socialist man would emerge. Okay. But so it was a kind of a low-level debate, though, again, the classical economists got the better of it. So in 1920, actually in 1919, he gave a paper that became the book that I was talking about. Mises wrote an article that completely destroyed the intellectual foundations for socialism. And his thesis was very, very simple. He said, under a socialist society, all the means of production would be owned by a monopoly central planning board, which means that there would be no prices. If all the factories and capital goods and natural resources were all owned by the same group, well then there would be no exchange. With no exchange, there would be no prices. There would be no prices of the inputs into the production process. Okay? Without prices of inputs, the socialists, let's call it the Central Planning Board, could never calculate its cost of production. Even if you allowed exchange of consumer goods, you would have prices of consumer goods, but you would never have prices of capital goods and of factories and so on. So you would never know if producing a certain good and not producing another good was more or less profitable. Socialism, as Mises said, was planned chaos, because it could never calculate the cost of production of any line of production. And I'll go into that in more detail. What Mises said was, in fact, therefore, economic calculation, allocating goods to their most urgent uses, could never exist under socialism. Or to put it another way, there could be never be a rational allocation of resources under socialism. He said, because, in fact, the preconditions, the things that you need for economic calculation were private ownership, not just in consumer goods, but in all goods, free exchange of all goods, including free exchange of shares of factories, stock market shares, and so on, free exchange of raw materials, and so on. The buying and selling in capital goods as well as of McDonald's hamburgers and shirts and CDs. You needed also the buying and selling of the things that were used to produce these things. Then you could compare output prices with resource prices. So you needed private property, free exchange, and a sound money. A sound money that was not continually fluctuating in value so that entrepreneurs could not calculate prices with any certainty. And he went on to point out, in fact, socialism abolishes these three preconditions. When all means of production are collectivized or socialized, you abolish private property in capital goods, you abolish free exchange, because there is no exchange, there's one owner, okay, one will. Okay, you have to have many wills and many different sort of values and as we'll see, expectations in order to have exchange on markets. And you wouldn't have sound money.